Okay, guys, well, it's great to be able to do this interview. Let's talk then about Motiv's value proposition, which is built around the concept of the power of simple. Tell us what the power of simple is all about.
Oh, well, James, I'll start on that question, and I'd just like to give you a bit of background. If you consider that I think it's widely accepted we live in an age of information overload, and on a daily basis are probably bombarded with about 360 pieces of content. Of these, only about 150 are even processed. And when you add to that many of them are ill-conceived and difficult to understand, far fewer make a strong enough impact or make an impression and therefore a sale. So for us, ultimately, it's about using the tools of design, language, psychology to bring clarity to the decision-making process of a consumer so that they can fully understand, make a simple decision and act on what's in front of them.
We create brands that ensure communication is as simple as it possibly can be, but no simpler. We work with existing brands to make their propositions stronger, continue to reinforce their brand values whilst keeping their messages clear and focused. The power of simple really helps products and services sell, and we can, from our experience and from the proof of the people we've worked with, that is certainly shown to be true.
Okay, so what prompted you to focus on the idea of making design and marketing communications simple? I mean, it's a fairly unique proposition that you've got there. So how did that come about?
Well, we realised that most communication is too complicated. There are far too many. There's far too much complex, confusing, and generally misleading information that exists. But why can't it be made more concise, more clearer, with a clear hierarchy? If you don't understand the process when you're looking at something, if you don't understand the way that you're supposed to read it, then you can't be expected to understand the story. And I think this is the way that we've always worked on our projects, the way we've always approached them. And we've just now distilled it down into our philosophy, really, that kind of really makes a difference.
And I suppose, having worked in the design industry for over 18 years, we've seen many instances of communication failure. And when you sort of start building a picture of what the most prevalent reasons for that are, it invariably comes down to miscommunication, either through a lack of message clarity or visual confusion. So we started working with the premise that less is more, really, and that simple concepts explained in a really clear way hold more appeal for an audience. And I suppose as a result, the results that we've gained for our clients in applying that more simple way of communicating has just been far more effective.
Yeah, it has been.
Okay, so following on from that then, how can the power of simple be applied to products and services that, if you like, are inherently complex? I'm thinking of markets such as technology, pharmaceutical, engineering, and other already complicated subjects to communicate. How can you apply the power of simple to something that's inherently complex?
Well, the more complex the subject matter is, I think the more impact the power of simple has. We've worked in all of those markets, incidentally, and found a common thread that all those industries have their own overcomplicated languages to explain the technical, and detail and thoroughness are inherently woven into these more, if you like, academic subject areas. And therefore there's a tendency for people working within them to become blind to the complexities. It's that whole premise of, I understand it, why doesn't everybody else? And that's certainly not the case when it comes to audience perception. And I think the skill Motiv brings to the complex is in acting as a filter between that technical content and the appropriateness and clarity of information reaching different audiences.
I mean, I'm just following up on Andy's point there, really. Interestingly, we've actually had a client, we're working with a client at the moment who's in the material science sector, which is a very complex subject. And, our client pointed out the chemistry behind the material science product they've got is very complicated. How are we going to explain that to their customers without getting horribly complicated? And we explain, well, the point of what we're trying to do here isn't to simplify what they do, it's to simplify the process that people understand what they do. And there's a very key difference between understanding those two elements of how you talk about it and how you sell it and how you explain what it does. We're not going to try and claim that we're experts in material science. That's their area of expertise. They thoroughly understand that, and we will use their knowledge to be able to explain it. But the benefits of what they produce and the markets they're going to be talking to, that's where our expertise and the power of simple will really, or has been proving to be working really well for them.
Okay, so you feel that you can adopt the power of simple to complex things, but on the other hand, focusing on the idea of simplicity, aren't you in danger of reducing design down to something that's very bland and everything looking the same because of the simple approach?
No, not at all. We don't view simplicity as the same as being simplistic, and we don't try and mislead by making things simpler than they actually are. That's being overly simplistic. It's more about focus, really. Simplicity is about retaining the truth and integrity of a message so that its presentation is in a more concentrated form, and that's not bland, is it? That's more potent. As Albert Einstein said, everything should be made as simple as it possibly can be, but not simpler. And I suppose for us that's about striking a balance, really, where you can't take anything away without leaving a message incomplete, but not adding unnecessary elements either that are going to confuse an audience. So putting ourselves in the position of users allows us to know when we've got it just right. And I suppose controversially, simplifying doesn't always mean removing things. In the context of user clarity, it can mean adding signposting cues. So even when the messages have been simplified, we make the content that remains more palatable by applying design techniques such as relative scaling, emphasis, hierarchy, and impact through visual stimulus. So, let's not lose focus here. All of these additions add to the end intent, and that is to increase the understanding of the subject matter.
What I'd add there is an example. Again, I'd love to quote my examples of how our philosophy works. But we've recently had an Internet of Things client who were developing a range of smart tech that are engaged with heating and lighting and power, and their goal was to try and get their product range into the Apple Store. And the first thing we did was help to clarify how they were going to put the product range together to put into packs. And then secondly, we were tasked with the actual challenge of making the packaging distinctive, branded, but simple. And after we'd been through the analysis and gone through our process of refining exactly what had to be on there and what didn't need to be on there, after a course of time, when we presented the ideas back, the client loved them, and the testament of it was that in the end they were submitted and accepted for the Apple Store. And as we know, Apple doesn't do oversimplification. Apple does what Apple does, and the fact that we've actually got a product range into the Apple Store based on our, what we said we would achieve with our philosophy is testament to how well it works.
Okay. As human beings, we do tend to overcomplicate things. I'm sure you'd agree. Not just in the design world and communications world, but in work and life overall. Bit of a psychology question in a way, but what do you think the reason for that is? Why do we as human beings tend to swerve towards complexity?
Yeah, I suppose because simple is hard to achieve, and seemingly simple decisions like right or wrong, best or worst, they need a context from the factors that influence them. So you have to make sense of competing arguments and weigh their importance before you know if it's right for yourself, and that's not an easy task. With too many options and choices, we tend to suffer from something called analysis paralysis, where the confusion's overwhelming to the point where you defer a decision and move on, which, you know, we're all inherently prone to leading us to choose the path of least resistance. It's easier to copy someone into, say, a bloated email and let them pick out what's relevant for themselves rather than for you to work out what's important for them. But I think we're slowly realising that people don't want more for the sake of more. They want less, but that less to be simply more effective. And any market where unnecessary complication stands between consumers and their successful use of a solution is about to be disrupted. You know, any service putting the burden on the end user to make sense of it should consider its days numbered. You know, if you're not the simplest solution, you're the target of one.
And as Andy says, it boils down to a really simple thing, that it's complicated is a reactive approach. Simple is a proactive approach, and it's much harder to be proactive than it is to be reactive. And that simple analysis of pretty much any given piece of communication, if you start at that point, then you start to create the change that it needs to be simple. Without that, it can't happen.
Let's talk about the client then. When you take a brief from a client, how do you go about distilling the content down that enables you, if you like, to apply the power of simple to it? Some client briefs are complex by nature. So isn't there a danger that if you approach a client brief with the attitude, if you like, of, oh, no, let's make this simple, that you'll lose something of the complexity that is perhaps very important for the client to communicate via the brief?
Well, I think it comes back to something I said earlier about the elements of the process are important to make simple. The actual, as well as the communication. It's the subject matter itself may be complex, but if we can distill down the process of how it needs to be told, that's the objective. And we've got a process that we do use. I won't go into lots of detail, but essentially it's to do with analysing, prioritising, empathising, distilling and evaluating. And when we use those 5 distinct attributes of the process to the brief and to the work that we develop, that ensures that you'll get the simplest solution that will communicate what needs to be communicated. And part of that, or a very, very important part of that process, is the evaluation stage, which is a continual reviewing of the success of the work that we've completed. So it's not then just proven by the fact that we like it or we think it's simple. It's then fed back by client reaction, any other feedback that we can get, depending obviously on the project. But that's vitally important to prove that it was successful, which proves that simple as a solution will work for that client and for any client.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I suppose from my perspective, just jumping back to the first stage, the analysis, you can only really shape a meaningful answer if you've first gathered all of the factors that are going to influence it. And I think that's the part where the client really needs to accept a bit of responsibility. You know, we question thoroughly and probe for the things that are going to directly and most strongly affect what needs to be communicated. And, you know, if we haven't got the raw content from the client in the first place, it's almost like a sculptor being asked to hew out the lump of rock that they're going to build that fantastic sculpture from. You know, so the analysis is quite a key part of the process.
Okay, guys, well, thanks very much for doing this interview. I hope it's given our viewers a lot of food for thought, and hopefully we can soon do another interview, get more in depth about the power of simple. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James.